Hello, this is Rodayna Abdo with Urban Nibbles, and my guest today is Nick Miller. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Udena.
Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
And today I'm really interested, very excited about today's conversation. None of us are unidimensional, but I think you in particular have a very polymorphic existence. Now, you're the founder of Miller Research and director, a research company. You're the founder of Blurrt, which utilizes Twitter data to identify what people are saying and catch emotion and do some predictive analysis, if
Hmm.
I understand it correctly. You have the Earth Summit, which you have been leading, I think, for 2 or 3 years, looking at sustainability. I think you're very involved with a food festival, this is a sustainable food festival within your town. And you are a non-meat eating sustainable sheep farmer. So,
Yeah, you could say we're just amateurs at everything, but yeah, we try and spread ourselves out a little.
well, you could say that, but I also, in how I know you, I know how deliberate you are with how the work that you do and how you live, and I think this ethos of being deliberative with what you do, and given the context that we're in right now, this pandemic context where people are being very reactive, and I see this as being a tremendous point of making very deliberate decisions on how we move forward in decisions that we make in how we live, how we occupy our cities, how we treat the planet, and all of these things. So I think you are going to have some incredible insight for us. And one of the areas that I'm interested in touching on, if we could, is looking at data, defining what we measure, how we measure it, and what we do with it, because these all can lead to the massive decisions that end up occupying all of our time and resources. So while we're at this point of being very, hopefully, being very thoughtful, and I think we should all be very deliberate in thinking how we move forward. Can you please just shed some light on, or talk about the work that you do, the things that you're thinking about now while we're in this COVID pandemic state?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's really interesting in terms of the deliberative perspective, because I think lockdown has given us all a chance to become a little more deliberative, particularly for those of us who've been, I guess, lucky enough to carry on working and working from home. We've had more space. We haven't had to commute. We've had more space to reflect on where we live and how we live. And I think that's probably going to have some lasting lessons. And I guess the whole crux of the conversation might be around kind of, are we at a tipping point going out of lockdown and going out of COVID? And as we emerge, do we want to try and create a new economy, a new kind of way of living? Or are we just going to scramble back to kind of remnants of the old normal in a panic to kind of reclaim the economy?
Exactly. I've recently been reading Kate Roth's Donut Economics, and I understand that the city of Amsterdam is going to be applying that, or is applying that philosophy. I'm not sure how it's moving forward. But this is all about what are we measuring? How are we accounting for economy? Is GDP gone as a measure? Should GDP be gone as the measure of measuring economy? So can you, and from the work that you're doing and conversations that you're having, can you talk a little bit about that as far as your perspective on where should we be putting our time and analysis, and what should we be measuring in order to know how to take things forward?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I guess first thing is let's all move to Amsterdam. It's just really nice to see a city that is forward-looking enough to take on that kind of concept.
Mm-hmm.
And we've already seen it to some extent, because I know the Amsterdam Economic Board, for example, has one of its indicators, going beyond GVA and employment, which are the standard indicators for most economic bodies. It's already set one of its targets to be a 2-year increase in healthy life expectancy for its citizens by 2025. And that's really symptomatic, I think, of the kind of thing that we need to do if we're going to start to reshape our economy. And I was kind of reflecting on that the other day, and I think people have really appreciated during lockdown that there are things beyond money, and particularly in terms of well-being indicators, and particularly in terms of healthy living indicators. One of the things, I live in the middle of nowhere, but actually I'm directly underneath the main air corridor from London Heathrow to the US. And so generally, we don't get blue skies. Vapor trails diffuse across the sky, and we have this permanent grey haze all the time. And for the last 2 months, we've had perfectly blue skies. And as a well-being indicator, it's quite hard to put money on it, but it's been really important. So if we start to translate that, and I know people who live in London, for example, have particularly noticed the increase in air quality because of a reduction in traffic. There's a reduction in noise. People are starting out, they're reclaiming the streets. There's a complete shortage of bicycles in the UK at the moment. You can't buy a new bicycle if you want one, which is fantastic, in a sense, because people are starting to reclaim their city centres. They're starting to reclaim their streets. They're starting to get to know each other again because they're walking on the streets and seeing their neighbours. I've noticed even in the village I live in, I've seen so much more of my neighbours in the last few weeks just because I've been cycling past and they're in their gardens and we stop to say hello, whereas normally we're just in our cars, we kind of flash at each other as we go past, but we don't have time for those conversations. So I think going forward, we need to start to think about kind of what are the indicators that are important to us, and the obvious ones, might be air quality, might be carbon, might be social cohesion. All of those things, so long as we can earn enough to live on, then some of those things start to become more important. And I think once you start to think in that way, then you start to question, what is the economy for? And I think it would, without being personal, I think it would be true to say that for the last few years, a lot of us have been working harder and harder to put more and more money into the pockets of fewer and fewer people. And I think there has been a bit of a sea change in perception about perhaps that's not the best way forward, and we could start to think in different ways. And yeah, I guess there are ways in which data can start to enable some of that stuff.
And in the microcosm that of your immediate surroundings, with the food festival, with the sustainable sheep farming that you're doing, is that also something that you can see with food systems coming forward and changing patterns?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's been really interesting, the things that the supermarkets ran out of very quickly. And it's been almost impossible to buy bread, flour or yeast, for example, because people have been home baking. We normally sell we produce sustainable sheep. We normally sell them to high-end restaurants. And of course, that market's been on hold for a few months. But we've seen a huge increase in people having the time to explore local sourcing and wanting to buy better quality food that they know where it comes from, they know how it's been produced, and they can be confident that it's not harming the planet. And if we can get those things to persist, then that's really, really good. Now, I think if you take that as a microcosm and try and apply that to larger communities, I think that's going to be really interesting in terms of the high street and the kind of counterfactual that the kind of generic, mass-produced, unsustainable or goods whose origins perhaps aren't as clear as they might be, suddenly become slightly less attractive to people. And I guess the hope is that people don't flock back to the mega shopping malls to buy the same old stuff that they could buy on the internet quite happily, and start to think more about how they can build a circular economy that's based on local sourcing and supply, how to go and become part of the supply chain themselves. And I guess at a kind of strategic level, what mechanisms we can put in place to make that a bit easier to achieve. And I think there's quite a few things that are starting to happen around that. And you mentioned Amsterdam. I think it's quite interesting that some of the best initiatives we're seeing are at city level rather than at state level. And it's possibly because you have a mayor, kind of mayoral system, or a small board who are running it. They're able to be more agile, and so they can put initiatives into place without the same kind of lead in times for legislation and things like that. So we're seeing Milan focusing on building much more cycling into their city. Central London is becoming traffic free in terms of private cars. Lots of good things happening at city level, and it'd just be nice to see that kind of whether those dots can be connected to create kind of much more strategic statewide kind of initiatives that'd be really good.
And earlier we were talking about the data collection, and I know that you are very involved on the social media end of things with Twitter and analysis. Are you have you been tracking, by the way, behavior related to COVID? Have you been tracking the last 3 months? Anything specific there from the Blurrt side that can shed light on people's expectations and demands for doing things differently, I hope, is what I'm looking for. But
yeah, interesting. I mean, most of the reaction has been about reaction to governments and the way, that, particularly in the UK, because I think COVID's been handled so badly, it's been very controversial.
mm-hmm.
A lot of the social media traffic has been around those issues rather than so much about looking forward. I think where there have been really positive things have been about the appreciation of some of the things we talked about, the clear skies, the clear streets. I know there was a tweet that went around quite a lot, just saying that London has the cleanest air since the 18th century. And these are the things that people are really trying to pick up and network, and it's as if they don't really have a channel to say, okay, these are the things we want, how can we make this happen now? And I think that's really interesting. So going back to kind of how do we start to achieve some of these things, perhaps we need to look at some really fundamental systems, and going back to the issue about, what is the economy for example, if we move away from the idea of GDP and GVA, then why do we have an economy? What are the things that are important to us? And if it becomes more about well-being and more about, the biggest emergency we have is a climate emergency at the moment. So we were thinking the other day, what would happen if people were paid in carbon instead of money, for example, and kind of how do you work through that through the system? And it's really, really complex, so you can get your mind around. But perhaps a simple example of that would be, what about if we replaced value-added tax with a carbon-added tax, so that products that have high embedded carbon through being produced unsustainably or being produced in far-off countries and being transported by air, food that has lots of road miles embedded in it, things like that, would suddenly be taxed much more heavily. And so that would kind of create much more of a level playing field for the kind of local circular economy we'd like to see. So maybe that's the kind of way we can start to think about putting the data frameworks in place that would allow some of these changes to happen in a really positive way. But it would be a pretty bold government that starts to think like that.
And are you seeing any takers? Do you see anyone embracing such initiatives other than Amsterdam?
First conversation I've had with Dana. This is the start.
Okay, this is a start, exactly. But I think this all with the bubbling of, as you mentioned, it's the mayors rather than at the federal, the higher level. It's I'm not going to say necessarily grassroots efforts, but it could be the pushing of the systems to move them. Ever the optimist that I would like to hope that this would happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is, then you get into the idea of data and how to use data to start, creating some of these changes and to come up with, how we are going to deal with the realities and the hard realities of the economy post-COVID. And I think it's quite interesting because in lots of ways, the lockdown crisis has simply accelerated a lot of processes that were going to happen anyway. We've seen, a lot of businesses that perhaps were marginal have faced bigger crises and those that were more sustainable. Undoubtedly, there's going to be a massive crisis in commercial property, and you would know much more about that than I would. But we know that was already unsustainable in a sense. In the UK, for example, I know the top 100 restaurants in the UK last year collectively lost £150 million. Not a sustainable situation at all. And part of that is because of the costs of running a business in a big city have been so astronomical, been really, really difficult. So I suppose the question is kind of, so what do our high streets start to look like post-COVID? And I know there's lots of other, the economy is much wider than the city and the high street and things like that, but it's quite a good paradigm for what happens elsewhere. And I suppose if we start to think about kind of, if we can embed some of the benefits of relocalization that's happened through lockdown into kind of the wider high street experience, whether it's in small towns or cities, then that has to be quite a good thing. And I think there's lots of ways you can start to think about doing that. But some of that has to be around kind of, what does commercial property look like? How can shops kind of make themselves more sustainable in a post-COVID world? And again, that throws up lots of challenges that can be helped by data. And I think, you know, we're starting to think about what some of those look like. And that could be quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. On the subject of data, and given also the social media tracking that you do and the privacy aspect, do you see, are you concerned about that? Do you think certain measures should be put in place, or we should, how do we proceed with collecting the right data?
Oh,
That's really
yeah.
coming up now.
It's really hard. I mean, on the face of it, I mean, I talk to my kids quite a lot about that, and you know, they tend to say more, well, you know, we've got nothing to hide. Have my data, I don't care.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have, you know, we are seeing major governments, and not least our own here in the UK, who've been, you know, frankly abusing data and securing personal data and using it in ways that we probably want it to be used. So yes, there are dangers, definitely, but I think those are issues that are here to stay. I don't know if we can put the genie back in the bottle on that one. If we want to have mobile phones, if we want to use the internet, if we want to do all the comms that we're doing, we're going to face those issues. And you know, it's down to kind of continuous pressure on some of the major platforms, perhaps the major retailers, the phone companies, to protect as much as possible. But I think it's quite hard to go back on that one. And really, data has to become open data, really.
This is a question that I ask everybody. So post-pandemic, moving forward, what do you feel is at risk of being left behind that should be carried forward? And the flip to that would be, what should definitely be left behind that is very likely to be carried forward given how we go about things?
Yeah, well, a risk is kind of the potential tipping point that we have at the moment, and it may not be universal, but there are pockets where there's a potential for a tipping point to say, okay, we want to run this place differently. We're going to get everybody out cycling, walking. We don't need to drive our cars anymore. I think that's the potential thing that could be lost, and at the same time, that is the big game for me, because that's kind of the tip of the iceberg or the thin end of the wedge. That means we can then start to think about, well, you know, do I need a car anymore, for example? I don't. I mean, what I want is the kind of thing, again, you have in, you know, many countries have got things like Zipcar, where you can have short-term rental agreements for personal transport. As soon as we get into driverless autonomous vehicles, that becomes much easier. You can just hail an Uber whenever you need a car, that's fine. Car turns up, you don't need a driver and all that, keep it for as long as you like. You've got much more flexibility with that model. Again, that's something that needs to be data driven. So if we have, you know, we get onto the whole issue of 5G then really, and kind of once we have 5G networks and we have capabilities for some of those things, then that can tie into all kinds of changes that could bring lots of benefits, could bring some risks as well. But again, in our cities, I mean, that could mean, can enable all kinds of things in terms of regulation of kind of how we regulate crowds, how we regulate traffic, potentially how we regulate pricing in our shops. You know, instead of having seasonal sales, we could have sales at periods of low attendance in, you know, quiet times. You know, maybe between 9 and 10 on a Tuesday morning, there might be some flash sale or something, which could be driven by data. So I think there's lots of things that could be driven in a really positive way if there's some mechanism for taking the benefits we've had from the last 3 months and say, okay, we want to relocalize, we want to make our economy more sustainable, more circular, we want things to be more distinctive on our high streets. And I can only use that distinctive word because actually that's an area where we've done a lot of work in the past. We've done town plans for about 25 towns in the UK about making high streets more distinctive. And that was quite an interesting exercise because it was all about getting away from the kind of homogenization of the high street and how do we kind of instill a sense of place into every town or every neighborhood community through things like local food and markets and events, independent shopping experiences, getting the narrative across a community. Now, all of those things are things that we're already starting to do on the internet in terms of giving people personalized experiences based on their browsing habits. That can be extended to physical space. So when you go into a restaurant, you know, my phone will tell the waiter that I don't eat red meat, for example, and so I'll get a customized menu that won't even feature it, and things like that. So we can start to build in the kind of personalized, bespoke retail experience that we're already starting to see across the internet, but build it into physical communities. And so, some of that stuff could be really, really interesting.
Yeah, very interesting point. Yeah, I'm thinking of the news feeds that we get, which is not necessarily always a good thing when it's just you only see a slither of the universe
No.
with our eyes. But I like how the same kind of concept can be taken to how we utilize resources and consume the spaces that we do. Well, I think we can go on endlessly on this, but in the interest of time, I will close us off for now, and we'll be watching this space and seeing what you're up to. Actually, just to close it with the sheep business, you said that you're just past lambing season now. So your customers now have do they continue to be the restaurants, or do you have a new client base as a result of the closure of the restaurants over the last couple of months?
I guess in the long term,
your model of operation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing new platforms springing up all over the place, because suddenly we're saying, well, we need a platform that says, you know, who are the local suppliers, you know, who can supply us good food locally. At the same time, we're seeing the restaurants restaurateurs who are having a really hard time developing new models of operation. And so, you know, we are trying to work with them. A lot of them are doing takeaways. They're starting to act as distributors themselves for their client base. And so we're working with them to do some of that stuff. But I think, again, there are opportunities that have become apparent through lockdown for us all to work slightly differently. And although it's going to be really painful for lots of us, you know, there's some excitement in that chaos. That something good and new and a bit more interesting could come out of it in the long term.
And it sounds like you're using tech for that as well. So integration of tech and data to sustain that business.
I really hope so. Yeah, and we certainly are. Yeah, we're using every platform and every channel we can think of.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Really interesting. Great to see you again, Nick.
Rodena, thank you so much for asking me. It's been great having the chance to have a conversation with you.
Really great chatting with you, Nick. Take care.
Cool.
All
the best. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.